Layouts are one of the most important part of any GUI framework. They can also be one of the most annoying parts because it's probably going to be a very common thing for you that you want to place a widget in a very specific spot, but somehow you just cannot place it there, which is a very frustrating thing to work with. So let's talk about layouts and what you can do in tkinter. There are three major methods that you have to be aware of. The most common one is called pack. This one takes a window and lets you stack widgets in a certain direction. By default, you are going from the top to the bottom, which means the first widget is all the way on the top, in the middle, and then you place other widgets below it. While you're doing that, you can also customize things quite a bit. For example, you can tell widgets to take up the entire horizontal space or the entire vertical space, or both as well. That also works. Besides that, you can also stack widgets in different directions. For example, you can go from left to right, right to left, or bottom to top. Other than that, pack is fairly simple and, well, that's kind of all you have to know about it. We're going to do a lot of examples later on with this one. The next layout method is called grid. This one works by creating a grid over the window. And this grid you are then using to place widgets in a certain position with a certain size. This could, for example, look like this, like this, like this. And you can also place widgets on top of each other with an overlap, like so. This system gives you a ton of flexibility. You could, for example, change the height of each row or the width of each column. Grid is generally the system you want to use if you want to create really complex layouts. Again, we're going to do a ton of examples later on. Finally, we have the place method. This one is kind of the simplest because you just take a window and you place widgets with a certain position. You can also change the size, and this one is fairly straightforward. You always have an X and a Y position, and you're using that to place the widget. With that, we have the three major tools that you are going to use. And what is super important that you have to understand is that you can combine these layout methods very easily. As a matter of fact, this is what you have to do to create any kind of complex layout. For that though, you do want to be aware of a couple of things. The most important part is that you are going to rely very heavily on parenting and frames. That way, you can combine different layouts and keep them organized. Basically, what you are going to do is you are placing one layout inside of a frame, and then you are placing that frame. That way, you keep everything much more modular and much easier to maintain. Let's do an example. This is going to be our main window. This I want to separate into two parts. For that, I'm going to use pack. We have a frame on the left that is a bit more narrow and a larger one on the right. Inside of the left one, I want to use the grid method, like so, to place a couple of other widgets, like so. This could, for example, be a simple menu with a couple of vertical sliders. Inside of the right frame, I want to place a couple of widgets like so. I can place them wherever I want since I am using place. With that, I have created a fairly complex layout that is still quite maintainable, because each part works inside of a frame and it makes it very easy to change things. We never create a layout that's too complicated. What you can also do is mix different layouts inside of the same frame. For example, you could place another widget on top of a grid. That way, you can basically create any kind of layout. So with that, we have the basics that you need. And let's do a couple of examples. Although I really want to emphasize, for this part, I only want to have a couple of very basic examples. Over the next couple of videos, we are going to expand on all of this quite a lot. As always, we have a super basic window. If I run all of this, we have a simple window. Doesn't do anything right now. Inside of this one, I want to create two widgets. Let me call it widgets. I want to have label 1 and I want to have label 2. I'm creating both with ttk label. The parent or the master is going to be the window. The text is going to be, let's say, label, and this could be label 1 or label 2. On top of that, there's one more thing that I do want to do. When we are creating the label, we can style this very easily by giving it a background. For this, we can just choose plain name colors like red. Or besides that, we can also use blue. That makes it much easier to see what's going on. These widgets I now want to place somewhere on the window, and for that we have the different layout methods. The easiest one is pack. This one we always use by getting a widget, let's say label 1, and packing it. In the simplest sense, you don't need any arguments, and I can just pack label 1 and label 2. If I run all of this, we have label 1 and label 2. Although in here you can specify a couple of different things. For example, you could specify the side. One could be left, and this always has to be a string. Or the side could be right. If I run this now, we have the label on the left and on the right, still in the middle though. We could also use bottom here. Also works just fine. And if we have the left side for both widgets, we are stacking them on top or to the right of each other again. Besides that, you can also tell a widget to expand. And this is either true or false. By default, it is false. If I set it to true, however, the widget is going to take up the entire available space. Which means in our case, the entire available space on the x-axis is this space here. Although we have label 2, which takes up this vertical space here. Which means the entire space the widget can take up is this width and this height. To make this even more visible, we can use the fill argument. For this one, we can either use x, y, or both. And this one tells the widget if it is going to fill the entire available space. Let me run this actually, then you see what I mean. There we go. Now label 1 is going to fill the entire available space. Whereas if I only set this to x, we are only filling the horizontal space. If I set this to y, we are only filling the vertical space. You can do that with the other widget as well. If I expand this, or I set expand to true, now we are splitting the entire window by 2. Which means tkinter is quite smart about it. If you have two widgets that are expanding, they are intelligently separating the space that is available. And let me set this to fill both. And then we get something like this. This is one way to place widgets. Besides that, we have the grid method. For the grid, we have to start with some basic setup. We have to get the window, and then we need column, configure, and we need, I think you can already see where this is going, we need row configure. For this one, we are determining, first of all, the index of the row, and then we need a weight. Let's go with 1 for now. With this, we have created one column. I can create a second one by duplicating this line and setting this to a 1. And let me add a third one with the index 2, and the weight for this one could be, let's say 2. With that, we have 3 different columns, although the final column is twice as wide as the other columns. So if I draw the entire thing, we have one column here that has a width of 1. We get a second column also with the width of 1. And then we have a final column, and this is as wide as the other 2 columns combined. The same thing we can do for the row. In here, I want to have a first row with the index 0, and a weight could also be 1. This information we can now use to get our label. Let me use label 1 and use the grid method. In here, we have to specify a row. Let's start with 0 and a column. This one I can set to 1. If I run this now, we have the label in some position. It's kind of hard to tell what's going on. Although if I draw on this, we have roughly one column here, and then we have the wider column here with the width of 2. The reason why this is so hard to see right now is because the label only takes up the minimal amount of space, so the space it needs to display the text. But this we can change as well, and the argument we need here is called sticky. This one tells it to which border the widget is going to stick, and this one needs compass directions. For example, I could place in here just north. That way, the widget is always going to stick to the top part of the cell. I can also add another direction, south. That way it sticks to the north and the south. And if I add all of the directions, then it's going to stick to all 4 sides. And now you should see a bit better what's going on. We have column 0, column 1, and then column 2, with column 2 being twice as wide as column 1 and 2. If I add label 2 in here, this is going to be even more visible. For this one, I still want row 0, but now I want column 0 as well. Now I can run this one again, and there we go. Now we have label 1 and label 2 and an empty column. This I can make even more complex by adding another row, and this one is going to be row 1. If I run this now, we can see we have split the entire thing in half. What I can also do is place label 2 and make it take up this entire space. For that, I have to tell it to occupy this column here and this column here. This I do with the column span method. Although first of all, we have to change row to 1, column to 1, and then we need column span. I want to tell the widget to span 2 columns. And if I run this now, we can see we have label 2 occupying 2 columns. Once again, I will go into much more detail later on, but if you understand this system, you understand 90% of it. It doesn't get that much more complicated. The final layout method we have is called place. For this one, again, I want to have one widget and I want to place it. Although this should be a dot. We need an X position and we need a Y position. For simplicity, let's start with X being 0 and Y being 0 as well. If I place this now, you can see we have label 1 in the top left. What you have to understand about this one is that when we are placing the widget, the actual position we are placing is the top left, this position here, with the entire window being a coordinate system that goes like so and so. The one thing that can be kind of confusing here is that if you want to go downwards, you have to increase Y. The higher this number is, the further down we go. In computers, basically any kind of layout always works like that. If you only know high school geometry, this can be kind of confusing, but you get used to it quite fast. If you do any kind of game development, they use the same system. Although X is a bit easier, if you want to go further right, you have to increase X. This one should be quite straightforward. Let's say I want to say X to 100. If I run this now, this distance here is 100 pixels. The same thing I can do for Y. If I set this to 200, we have 200 pixels from the top. We know in our case, the window has a size of 600 by 400, which means if I set the Y position to something like 380, we should have label 1 almost at the bottom. And there we go. This looks pretty good. You can actually also specify a few more things in here. You have the width. I could, for example, set this to 200, and you have the height. This I could set to, let's say, 100. And now if I run this, we can, well, only see part of the widget. That's because it is so far down. If I set this to 200, now this is more visible. We now have a widget that is 100 pixels from the left. This number here, it is 200 pixels from the top. That is this number here. And it has a width of 200 and a height of 100. With that, you can place a widget basically wherever you want. And all of these numbers are absolute. So we always have pixel positions. You can, however, if I am placing label 2, with the place method again, use relative numbers. For this one, you would use relative X and relative Y. What you have to understand about this one is that now we don't have pixel positions. Instead, what we are doing for this one is, this one here is the entire window, and we are declaring that the top left point is position 0 and 0 for X, and 0 and 0 for Y. The bottom right position, this one here, is going to be 1.0 for X and 1.0 for Y. Which means if we have relative x 0 and relative y being 0 as well, we are going to be in the top left position. This point here. Let's try this one. Let's try. And there we go. Label 2 is in the top left position. If I change this to 0.5 and 0.5, now label 2 is roughly in the middle. Or to be more specific, we are placing the top left point. This one is right in the middle of the window. I can actually demonstrate this by reducing the size of this thing. They can see this label 2 is always in the middle, even if we change the size of the window. This, however, doesn't apply to label 1, because for this one we only have pixel positions. Generally, when you're using place, you want to use relative positions. You can also set the relative width. Let's say if this one is 1, now the widget is taking up the entire space, like so. Although, keep in mind here, we are cutting off the widget a tiny bit. This one here is the entire width of the window, and widget 1 is going to have the entire width as well. However, we cannot see this part here because the widget is starting on this position, so some bits are cut off. To change that, we would have to change what is called the anchor. This is the point you're actually placing. If this one here is the widget, we are always placing this point. And then the rest of the widget is going to follow. By default, we always place the northwest point. But we could also place the southwest point, or the southeast point, or the northeast point. Besides that, we could also place the center. Let's try with this one. If I place in here, this has to be a string. I place the center. Now we are placing the center of the widget, and we are filling the entire window width. We could also change this to southeast, and there we go. Now we are placing only the right point, which means if I move this a bit to the side, the point we are placing is the southeast, meaning this point here is right in the middle of the window. And then the entire width is going to be something like this, which means once again, we are cutting off some parts. You can play around with this a lot, and I would recommend you to do so, but this is all you have to know for the basics. And well, these are the 3 major ways to place elements inside of a window. Over the next couple of videos, I'm going to go into a lot of detail. For this video, I'm not going to add an exercise. Instead, I would recommend you to go over all of this and make sure you at least have a very basic understanding of how this is going to work. Ideally, create a few more labels and just place them wherever and see if you can work with all of them at least reasonably okay.